Well, good afternoon from here in London, but good morning to our special guest today, Harold James, who's dialing in from Princeton, New Jersey. And we're absolutely delighted to have Harold here because he's going to be talking about his book, Making a Modern Central Bank. And I must say, as an author, if I'd ever written a book in that zone, to have somebody like Paul Tucker produce a review in the IMF magazine was a heck of a piece of kudos there. So well done, Harold. It's going to be exciting because Harold's going to be talking us through many of the political implications. This isn't just a history book, nor is Harold really just an historian. He has his hands in a number of areas. Now, you'll know me. I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of Zien. And it really is my privilege to be able to introduce many of these webinars, principally because our sponsors are so generous and tolerant, if I might say so, allowing us to wander freely across just about anything to do with technology, economics, and finance. And interestingly, today, our guest has quite interesting and deep views on things like cryptocurrencies. So this isn't just about central banking on its own or history of any form. It's really about today's issues. And with so many things facing the world today, whether it's the role of the ECB, our new Andrew Bailey, who's taken over from Mark Carney writing a book and moving on to climate change, the role of the central bank may be changing as never in the future. In fact, if anything, I'm always reminded of Montague Norman, who was the Bank of England's longest serving governor from 1920 to 1944. And he was once reputed to have told his economic advisor, "You are not here to tell me what to do. You are here to tell me why I have done what I have already decided to do." So we're seeing the personalities in central banking making a huge difference as well. Anyway, my job is to get out of the way and let you hear from our expert. Uh, I might point out a few quick things. Firstly, the slides will be up at some point later today. We will also have the recording up within approximately 48 hours. And we have reserved adequate time for questions and answers, of which I suspect there will be many. Please use the GoToWebinar question facility to send questions in, and I will feed them into a conversation with Harold. So with no further ado, Harold, if you'll allow me, I'm just about to give you control of the keyboard and the mouse, and we very much look forward to learning. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. It's a great pleasure to be with you and to talk with you all across the Atlantic about this book. It was commissioned as part of the series of the official history of the Bank of England. It's the latest installment going up to the early 2000s. So roughly in accordance with a 20-year law in terms of the release of documents. The documents from the 1990s are available for consultation. And this book deals with the bank at an absolutely crucial moment of transformation, and hence the title, Making a Modern Central Bank. In a way, the theme of the book is really announced in the first paragraph, and I just thought I would show you the first lines of the book. At the end of the 1970s, the Bank of England was a microcosm of the United Kingdom, steeped in history, but deeply confused about its identity and inconstant in its performance. And then there's a change. The country became modern. People talk about cool Britannia. So did the bank. It became modern. And by the beginning of the 2000s, the Bank of England exemplified what was then thought to be the best practice of a modern central bank, running a clearly defined rule-based system based around an inflation target. And in a way, I could just stop there. And this looks like a success story, but it's not a success story in the sense that there are problems, and any kind of movement, any kind of reform produces differences, changes, unanticipated outcomes. And at the end, I want to turn to those. The fundamental problem that the bank dealt with in this period is overcoming the legacy of very, very high levels of inflation. The 1970s, we generally think of the 1970s as the period of the Great Inflation, but you can see in some comparative statistics, the UK really stands out as having higher levels of inflation than other major industrial countries. In the middle of the 1970s, so the year in which I started my university course in Cambridge in 1975, it was 25% inflation. There's another peak at the end of the 1970s, another peak in the late 1980s, and you can even see, I think, some little evidence of a UK oddity in the global financial crisis. Inflation doesn't fall as much as it does in the other major jurisdictions. So this was the challenge, but the bank didn't really know what it was supposed to do. If you want to think about what a central bank does, I guess it's important to look at the legislation that sets it up. And for the United States, it's very clear. The Federal Reserve Act in 1913 talks about the establishment of Federal Reserve banks to furnish an elastic currency, in other words, to supply currency at moments when there were shortages, bank failures, and the 1913 legislation comes out of the legacy of a big financial crisis in 1907. Germany, the Bundesbank law talks about securing the currency. The Eurozone, the ECB statute makes it quite clear that the primary objective of the European system of central banks is to maintain price stability. But there's nothing equivalent to that in the UK. If you go to the legislation in 1694, the act that created the Bank of England says that the major goal of the Bank of England is for the carrying on the war against France. It's at the moment of the greatest and most costly of Louis XIV's wars. The Charter talks about promoting the public good and benefit of our people, but there's no specific objective given. It isn't given in 1844 in the Peel Act, which creates in practice the modern system of note issuing. It isn't in the Bank of England Act in 1946 when the post-war Labour government nationalised the Bank of England. And it's only in the 1990s that internally the bank starts to work on producing a statement of its purposes, why it's there. And the 1990 formulation, just an internal document at this stage, has three objectives for a central bank. First of all, and that looks familiar from continental Europe, the stabilization of the value of the currency as the necessary precondition for the achievement of the government's wider economic goals. That looks very much like the language of the Bundesbank or the language of the European Central Bank. But the second one, the maintenance of stability in the financial system, is an objective that doesn't appear in the ECB statute in that strict formulation. And the third one is even more peculiar, the promotion of the efficiency and effectiveness of the UK financial services sector. And it immediately raises a question. Is the central bank not there to promote the good of the whole of the country, the whole of the economy? And in the case of a possible conflict, clashes of interest between, say, finance and industry, finance and manufacturing, that had dominated a lot of the discussion in the course of the 20th century, should the bank take a position? Should it promote the efficiency and effectiveness of the UK financial services sector? And in practice, that third objective was dropped in the 2000s. In 1998, the Bank of England Act is passed by Parliament. It's heralded already in the weekend in 1997 after the Labour election victory. It's the first big announcement of the new Labour government. And it amounts to really two revolutionary steps. First of all, taking on a modern definition of what a central bank is, maintaining price stability and supporting the economic policy of Her Majesty's government, including its objectives for growth and employment. That looks like the dual mandate that the Federal Reserve had was formulated in the 1977 Humphrey-Hawkins Act. But secondly, and this was a surprise for everybody and a big surprise for the Bank of England. The financial supervision and regulation is taken away from the Bank of England and given to the FSA, to the Financial Services Authority. So this is the legislation that made the modern central bank. I want to discuss briefly how it got there. It got there by changing the way that it communicated. In the 1970s, and the bank was still very much the old-fashioned bank. It was the Bank of Montagu Norman in many ways, and Michael mentioned that in the introduction, how Montagu Norman was famously incommunicative, not very effective at speaking to markets, to speaking to anybody. One of the great moments in British monetary history is the hearing of the Macmillan Committee in 1931, when John Maynard Keynes just ripped the governor of the Bank of England intellectually to shreds. Instead, in the 1970s, the bank operated through written memoranda and beautifully worked out, and they're fundamentally designed to communicate with the Treasury. John Ford, the author of this particular example, somebody who also wrote a history of the Bank of England for an earlier period, John Ford had the idea that Britain was ruled by a macroeconomic executive in which the Treasury and the bank was symbiotically linked to each other. And writing memoranda was the way that the bank tried to convince the Treasury of its viewpoint. The bank couldn't publish without the permission of the Treasury, so everything that the bank put in public had to be run through a Treasury vetting process. In the 1980s, this really changes, and the bank moves in a new way. The leading figures of the 1980s, the two people who were thought of as potentially the future governor of the Bank of England, later Sir Eddie George, David Walker, later Sir David Walker, they're above all effective as communicators because they're good at talking, they're good at verbal communication. People like to say that Eddie George had a silver tongue. David Walker is called Walker the Talker in the corridors of the bank. And George's influence was enormous in the 1980s because he spoke and he knew how to speak to the Prime Minister, to Margaret Thatcher, somebody who was uniquely interested in the details of monetary policy in a way that no Prime Minister before had ever been, and I think only Gordon Brown after has been. So they were talking to power. But in the 1990s, the bank becomes more public, and the way it expresses itself is the way that it fundamentally expresses itself now, through the presentation of data, through visual material. Part of the charm originally of the inflation report that was first produced in the middle of the 1990s is that it lays out material and the Treasury can't in any way object to that, can't edit it, can't censor it, can't editorialize on it. So the presentation of an inflation report, and you can see the only difference is today that the range of inflation expectations looks much, much wider. One part of the story is about the internationalization of central banking, and the big models for central banking are in the 1980s, the Bundesbank. Mrs. Thatcher greatly admired the head of the Bundesbank at the time, Karl Otto Pohl, and frequently presents him as a model. But I think more importantly, in the 1990s, the figure who is really inspirational for many changes in the UK is Alan Greenspan. Just two instances of it. In 1990, there was an acute controversy inside the government about whether to move or not move into the fixed exchange rate system of the European monetary system. And the Treasury, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the Bank both want to move into the EMS. The Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher, still is very hesitant, reluctant, and needs to be convinced. And the way that the bank thinks that she can be convinced is to get Alan Greenspan to telephone her. And Alan Greenspan presents a very striking, I'm not sure it's quite historically accurate, but a striking picture in which he says that the European monetary system, this fixed exchange rate regime that the Europeans then had, is the equivalent of the 19th century gold standard. The 19th century gold standard instilled discipline, instilled a spine for monetary policy, a hard spine around which monetary policy could be oriented. And on that basis, Mrs. Thatcher agreed to the adoption of the spine theory and of the European monetary system. British entry took place on the 5th of October 1990. In the 1990s, when it comes to discussing how an independent central bank should function, the opposition figures, Gordon Brown and his advisor Ed Balls, travel repeatedly to talk to Greenspan in Washington and New York in order to really see how the model of the Fed works and how it can be applied to British circumstances. The movement is to greater credibility. This is a figure taken from a paper by Michael Bordeaux and Pierre Siklos on central bank credibility, and you can see the two phases are in the early 1980s, in the deep, deep recession, and in the early 1990s, another deep recession, where the central bank attains some kind of credibility. And this, it seems to me, is the precondition for the inflation targeting. And the very short period, 1990 to September 92, when the pound was in the European monetary system, is in that way quite crucial in breaking inflation expectations and making a better exchange rate regime with a better monetary regime possible. One other aspect that is really central to the story of the book is the way in which the bank moves into banking supervision as a consequence of legislation in 1979 and in 1987, how the movement to define legally the role of the bank in banking supervision as a result of that kind of legislation restricts the previous informal way in which the bank had operated in a very complex financial environment where there are many, many specialized functions in the London market. There's a system of discount houses standing in between the banks and the Bank of England. The incentive is that these lightly capitalized houses really have to keep an eye on what they're doing in terms of the bills that they buy, because they face a great risk. So in that sense, supervision is done informally. As you move into the 1980s and it's legally formalized, then the bank looks more and more inadequate. And you can see an old style system breaking down. And the instance that I devote some attention to is the moment at the beginning of the British membership of the European monetary system in October 1990, when there was a discussion of whether one of the discount houses had not had an insider leak from the bank about the forthcoming membership of the EMS. It was announced after the close of markets on Friday, October the 5th, 1990. But in the last half hour of trading, one of the discount houses took very, very substantial positions, and other banks and the other discount houses complained. There was an investigation, and it became clear that there wasn't a formal leak, but on the other hand, that the way that the discount houses went into the bank and looked at the bank and looked at the way that the bank employees were acting, were behaving, there seemed to be something odd on that Friday. There was an exuberant mood. There was lots of bantering, lots of joking, and the outcome is, if you really want to make a transparent market, you can't have that kind of interaction. You have to have information that's available to everybody at the same time. And these meetings with the discount market were then stopped. The discount houses themselves were bought up by big financial institutions, big financial conglomerates, and faded away. So the bank's record in terms of banking supervision was marked by some big problems, some big failures, and those figure very prominently in the case that Gordon Brown made for taking banking supervision away from the bank. The failure of Johnson Matthey in the middle of the 1980s, of BCCI in the early 90s, then of Barings, they looked like instances of regulatory failure. I think this is in part a slightly one-sided view, because the failures were very conspicuous, but the successes were not conspicuous. And in the recession of the early 90s, one of the major clearing banks was very close to failing, Midland. It was rescued by a very, very secretly run Bank of England operation. But nobody wanted to talk about that, and nobody knew about it. Gordon Brown didn't know about it in the 1990s, and in fact, in a kind of remarkable contrast, France, Spain, Sweden, Norway had major banking failures in the recession of the 1990s. The UK didn't. That looks like a success, but what people see are the failures of the old supervisory regime. And so in 1997, 1998, this new outfit is created and the Bank of England is unleashed. That's a cartoon of the time with the face of Eddie George given to the dog that slipped its leash, and Gordon Brown is happy for it to have slipped its leash. That might be the story. I thought that at the beginning I indicated maybe it's not as simple as all of that, and some of the things that were really problematic in the old bank, in the world of the 1970s, are coming back. After the financial crisis, the link between fiscal and monetary policy is monetary policy doing quasi-fiscal work. That discussion took off after 2008. Do you need to do debt management in order to structure the expectations of the market? That was also part of the world of the old bank. Financial regulation, the bank comes back again, and that separation with the FSA is undone by the Cameron government. Even moving into industrial policy, something that the bank did intensely in the 1970s and in the early 1980s, particularly in the recession of the 1980s, early 1980s, there's a lot of restructuring of individual industries with the bank talking to bankers and changing management. Industrial policy, do you need to do that? And then we saw the picture of the bank slipping the leash. What about what's sometimes called the big cat? Just a few weeks ago, the chief economist of the bank, the current chief economist, Andy Haldane, gave a striking speech which took as its title a collection of the statements of Friedrich von Hayek on the inflationary threat in the 1970s. And Haldane began by saying there are few, if any, historical precedents to help judge the response of the economy to this scale of shock after the corona crisis and the degree of policy stimulus. Well, are the presidents, if there are presidents, they really lie in the 1970s or maybe in the post-war era of the early 1920s or after the Second World War, when there are also big increases of debt. So inflation expectations, a story that looked as if it was completely over, with this consensus, all the convergence among all the big central banks, among all the big industrial countries, increasingly also big emerging market economies have low rates of inflation. But Haldane pointed out that the situation today looks different from that of the 2008 financial crisis. The degree of stimulus is much, much bigger. And so 18% the primary balance compared to 8% in the global financial crisis. Whereas, and obviously it's difficult, we all know it's difficult to measure output gaps because it involves assumptions about the future trajectory of the economy. But the output gap looks less today, and we think that there may be a growth of potential demand as savings have built up in the big countries. There's worldwide a growth of money. The demographic circumstances that pushed inflation expectations down may be changing, and globalization, which brought cheap goods to big industrial countries as the product markets opened up in the 2000s, may be succeeded by, in the wake of the COVID crisis, a push towards deglobalization. So it looks as if some of the problems are there. And in those circumstances, the independence of central banks, this was the policy answer of the 1990s, the independence of central banks and the relationship of the central bank to the political process looks much, much different and much more complicated than it did when you could think of delegating a simple monetary policy task to an independent body with a set political goal of stable prices. So at the end of it, of this presentation, I thought it would be interesting to hear your reactions and your expectations for inflation for next year in the UK. Do you envisage inflation over 2%, over 3%, over 4%? I can't vote, but you can, and I'd be very interested in your response. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very, very much, Harold. That was masterful. Folks, it's the end of the class lesson, and you have your class quiz. 3/4 of the audience have voted. I'll leave it up for just a split second longer. And just close the poll in a second. There we go. Almost everyone's voted. And I'm now about to share the results. Well, there you go, Harold. The class is equally split across all three categories for the most part there.
I mean, those are presumably cumulative then, that sort of everybody who votes for 4% also thinks it's going to be over 2%.
Yeah. Well, Harold, we've got a lot of questions here. Just to start off with a quick one, if I might. How was your book received by the bank, and did they make any comments on it, or what was your relationship like during the production?
Well, I mean, obviously, an exercise like this couldn't have been done without the full cooperation of the bank, and they were just enormously helpful in making the material available and making the archives, in finding odd documents in the archive, making contacts. Normally, I think the expectation would be that you would have some kind of big launch party, but because of the pandemic, we didn't have that. We had a really quite interesting extended discussion that was organized by OMFIF with former policymakers. Mervyn King and Paul Tucker were part of that discussion, as was Norman Lamont, and quite interesting discussion as to who was more involved in really devising the inflation targeting strategy. Norman Lamont wanted to claim that for himself and for the Treasury. I don't think that's right. The documents that I've seen really indicate that very, very quickly after September 1992, it was Mervyn King who was drawing on a specific example from New Zealand, put this idea out. But I mean, the answer is no. There isn't a formal response to it, and there's no reason why there should be. It's not an indictment of the bank. It's not a eulogy of the bank. It's an examination of the bank's history.
Good. Joe Zamet Lucia says that everyone puts down the control of the 1970s and 1980s inflation to central banks. But are they forgetting that the Thatcher government's contractionary fiscal policy? And are they conveniently forgetting that much of the control of inflation happened before the Bank of England was given independence?
Well, that's right. I mean, that's the story that I'm basically telling. And the story, though, I think is quite a nuanced one in terms of the early 1980s, because indeed the centerpiece of the strategy is the government's medium-term financial strategy. So this is the brainchild of, above all, of the Nigel Lawson, who was then the financial secretary in the Treasury. And later becomes chancellor after '83. Yes, it's the fiscal policy which was unbelievably brutal. But one of the less known aspects of it is the way in which the bank relaxed its monetary policy. And I think probably headed off in that way what would have been a major rebellion. Many people, including there was the famous letter of the 364 economists, including Mervyn King, signed that attacking the 1981 budget. That was a moment when the government's policy might have disintegrated, and undoubtedly, if we look at it, the fiscal monetary mix wasn't the ideal one. But you needed some kind of monetary policy loosening in order to just head off the savage recession that was affecting the UK, and the degree of political opposition also in the Conservative Party. There was a lot of difficulty at that moment. So yes, I mean the conquest of inflation does occur in these moments when there isn't inflation targeting, and I think you couldn't use inflation targeting in a moment when expectations are completely unanchored. That's why sometimes people might think, given the logic of what I've just said, that wouldn't it have been better to move to this already in the early 1980s? Well, it wouldn't have been credible. It just wouldn't have been credible, and it would have blown up. And so, without those two episodes, and in some ways, both of them misjudged about the membership of the EMS and the exchange rate at which Britain moved into the EMS, there were big misjudgments there, but they were also important in terms of setting the agenda and making the subsequent regime more viable.
Yeah. And there's always been this tension, hasn't there? I mean, the way in which regulation itself has evolved as a model. So at the same time, we had the privatizations going on, and this idea of an independent regulator was a relatively new thing to be that directly independent, and that would have been Ofgem and a number of other places where we're looking. It was a zeitgeist of trying to move to independence, transparency, and control. It was an intriguing time. You know, we had the RPI minus X for the utilities, for example. So very interesting. Got a couple of comments here. Quite a few people are picking up, obviously, on the political aspects, but they're also sort of curious. So Bob McDowell points out, he suggests that we are in an area where central bank has to be a tool of UK economic and financial policy. There's an interesting comment from Mike Clark. I'll give just a teensy bit of context to that, Harold. There's been a lot of discussion about ultimately all the various risks that the nation faces can fall on the government's balance sheet. Hitherto, it's been seen to be economic crises, but we've seen in Corona that that's fallen onto the government balance sheet. And people have been talking about other things in the past, for example, terrorism, which led to the creation of Pool Re, or there are a number of people who are involved with long finance who are looking at, for example, cyber catastrophe. So you've got this bit where this is Mike's point. The fiscal and monetary policy are linked by a national risk policy, so that central banks are actually less independent than we think. So do you see the central bank's balance sheet very much as a subsidiary of the nation states?
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think it frames very nicely the peculiarity of this era in the 1990s and 2000s, that this was an era in which there was a lot of apparent stability, and the end of the Cold War, the reduction of defense expenditure, that was the opening up of the world, globalization. That was part of the setting of it. And just to go back to Michael's point briefly, before I get onto that risk issue, the idea of an independent central bank had already been raised by some people in the 1980s. The governor, Robin Lee Pemberton, was personally sympathetic to it, but the person who was really championing it most and was pushing this idea most was the Chancellor, Nigel Lawson. So it was in Lawson's mind, but the Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher, was consistently opposed to that. She had very much the view that we just heard about the way in which the national balance sheet hangs together. It's all part of one system, and she didn't want to lose control of the ability to set interest rates. So, that in the UK in particular, with the tradition almost entirely of adjustable mortgage rates in a country in which there's a lot of home ownership and in which Mrs. Thatcher promoted home ownership, makes interest rate very, very sensitive. So it's manufacturing is hit by the interest rate environment, but home ownership is directly affected, house prices. And in the 1990s, that was a large part of the political dynamic. And from the point of view of the Labour Party, it looks really rather different in that the perception in the 80s and 90s was that Labour was, in every country actually, that left-wing parties were fiscally less responsible than right-wing parties. And so the markets would expect to charge more for lending. The borrowing costs would be higher. And what Gordon Brown saw correctly was that tying one's hands in this act that got the Chancellor completely out of the exercise of setting interest rates would lead to an increase in the credibility of monetary policy and hence a reduction of borrowing costs. And so it made it possible for the government to borrow more cheaply by tying its hands in this way. And I think that's a point that could only have come from a centre-left party rather than the centre-right party.
Time for a few more quick ones if we can. Peter Cousins says, you mentioned deglobalization. Could you just expand on the drivers for that as you see them?
The, the, um, the corona crisis has produced, I think, a zero-sum game mentality, and you can see it very clearly in the discussion of who gets vaccinated, who gives vaccines out more efficiently, how the UK seems to be doing better than the EU, how the US is doing better than the EU or the UK. And in those circumstances, countries want to secure their own supply chains. It's more important that you get, for instance, the vaccine than that other countries get the vaccine. So you want to produce domestically. That's going to make production more expensive. Shortening supply chains is a process that was occurring already before 2020, but in part for technical reasons, but in part also for security reasons. All of that is going to make for scarcities, and this big surge of cheap imports that really made the 1990s and particularly the 2000s what they were. That's likely to end in scarcities and in the attempt of governments to reimagine industrial policy. You see exactly the discussion in France about Danone is very much that. You need national champions all over the board. And that's what's pushing deglobalization and what may be pushing increased costs. Will it last forever? I don't actually think so, but it's going to be a temporary phenomenon.
Um, Annette Nabavi, and I know you have thoughts on this because we were speaking about central bank digital currencies and cryptocurrencies in the green room. I was just wondering, could you comment on whether you feel that a central bank has a role in monitoring or regulating cryptocurrencies?
Well, the moment that you think a central bank has some responsibility for financial stability, you really get there automatically. So yes, I mean, I think that's actually the central challenge of central banking at the moment. How to deal with a world in which there are alternative currencies, some of which are provided by traditional currencies, funding in dollars, but some of which are increasingly provided by private sector providers. And the possible threat to financial stability is enormous. And so we're trying to ensure that if collapses occur, they don't bring down big changes, don't bring down the whole of the economy. In some ways, it's easier with platform technologies. I think if a platform collapses, it's easy for all participants to move to another platform. I mean, for instance, if Uber or Lyft stopped existing tomorrow in another domain, you wouldn't end this. You would just get all the drivers and all the users moving to a different platform. So it may be that widespread use of private blockchain technologies will make the world safer, but in the transition, you have to expect a lot of turbulence.
Good. Now, it's often said, it's kind of the great man theory of history, or is it really just the institutions that plug along and we lend our name to them? And I've got a question here from Bob again. How important is it to have a technically competent chancellor to complement the central bank? And is this illustrated historically in the successes of the Bank of England?
I mean, it's a great question, but technically competent chancellor. So there are really two massively powerful figures in the period that I'm dealing with. Nigel Lawson in the Thatcher period, and then Gordon Brown as the chancellor in the Labour government, and but both of those figures were really massively influential. But obviously, the decision that Gordon Brown made was to have the bank at arm's length, and one of the ideas, I think, of having the Monetary Policy Committee was that that would weaken the position of the governor in the bank. In practice, it didn't do that, and that's one of the little oddities, I think, that needs to be explained in terms of the politics of personality, because both Eddie George and Mervyn King were really very powerful personalities, and they pushed the debate. Having said that, the UK had a very good policy outcome in the 2000s, but other central banks on inflation did almost exactly as well. So with a different institutional environment, the ECB or the Fed had good outcomes at this period, and it's difficult to attribute it to a particular person or even to an institutional mechanism.
Just a final point, wrapping up a few of the comments and the questions. We're struggling, aren't we, in many ways? We want an independent central bank, but it's political. We want transparency, but we seem to forget transparency is a tool, and we now make it so transparent that we can all second guess its predictions, and its consultations and deliberations are increasingly public. But we also want it to make hard decisions and not have to look back and say, "Oh, I'm consistent." Have we made it almost? You remember, of course, Eddie George was famous for being able to talk with the market. He was not just a glib person, but he elicited a lot of information. Have we made it almost impossible for central banks under this idealized structure to really talk with the markets and engage with them?
I mean, you're right, and I'm glad you drew that out. That's one of the implications of the book, that the old bank relied on a lot of informal contacts. The new bank can't and doesn't want to do that. So they operate in a different way. But the reality that they have to deal with, and I think this is driving the discussion, is just the reality of very high levels of government debt. And once you get to those high levels of government debt, it's difficult for central banks really to assert themselves against the government, because the risk, the immediate downside, is you blow up the government. If you're the Federal Reserve in the United States, you blow up the world if you move on the interest policy abruptly. We saw a little bit of that in the taper tantrum. So you're really trapped in the world in which there are very high levels of government debt, and that's I think what's at the heart of the current debate.
Harold, this has been great, really great. You're truly masterful, but we're running up against our M50 target, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to call things to a halt, sadly. It's interesting for me in particular. I happen to have been very fortunate to have met just about everyone you mentioned in the modern era, and to have the opportunity sometimes to socialize with them. And I don't think people understand the immense burdens on their shoulders, operating in conditions of large-scale ignorance. And I'll just quote Norman again, looking back on himself in '48. He actually said about the Great Depression, we achieved absolutely nothing except that we collected a lot of money from a lot of poor devils and gave it to the four winds. And for somebody to have to live their life and end it like that, I don't think we appreciate how much pressure we put on some of these people. Anyway, it falls to me to give 3 quick rounds of thanks in the minute available, and that's to say, firstly, to our sponsors as ever. I'm glad that you let us hit this subject area. It's really fun. It's really interesting, and I'd hope to have Harold back because he's got a lot more in him than just this particular book. There's a lot of areas that he's working on. Thanks to you, the audience, as ever. Some really great, insightful questions, and I've been getting little snippets of history quoted at me, but I didn't have time to read them out. A reminder that we've got quite a bit coming up, not least tomorrow, the challenge to insurance and pensions from stability risks. And Dr. Louise Pryor, who's the president designate of the Institute of Actuaries, will be giving that. As ever, go to the website and you'll see it. But my final round of thanks has to be most definitely to you, Harold. You've been super, so kind of you to dial in as well from America. Unfortunately, technology does not permit me the ability to give you the audience applause from the audience, so I have my ersatz Korean karmic clapper, and that will have to do, I'm afraid, for applause. But we would seriously love to have you back. That was most insightful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.